Hello. Well, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and to the Scottish History Society for inviting me to speak at this year's joint meeting of those two august bodies. I'd also like to acknowledge right from the very start that this paper is the result of a 3-year project funded by the AHRC, Ben Jonson's Walk to Scotland, 1618, and that anything I talk about is very much the product of a team benefiting hugely from the work of James Loxley and also Julie Sanders of Nottingham. I'd also like to recognise the published work of several of the Scottish History Society's most distinguished members in helping my attempt to reconstruct the historical background, in particular that of Alan MacDonald, Julian Goodare and Laura Stewart. So, Ben Jonson's foot voyage to Scotland, 1618, performing Union. On Wednesday, the 8th of July, 1618, the famed playwright Ben Jonson, writer of Volpone amongst many others, and the recently appointed court poet of King James VI and I, set out on foot to walk to Edinburgh. He was then at the height of his fame. 2.5 months later, he arrived at the Netherbow port at the foot of the High Street to be mobbed by throngs of women running to see him, some bringing sack and sugar, others aqua vitae. The following day, Jonson was ceremoniously led to the market cross by St Giles Cathedral, where assorted gentlemen and burgesses toasted the completion of his epic journey. Jonson, in return, drank to the assembled crowd, who, being so thick in the street that we could scarce pass by them, they ran in such throngs. The windows also being full, everyone peeping out of a round hole like a head out of a pillory through the wooden shutters of the High Street's windows. 9 days later, on Saturday the 26th of September, the Provost and Burgesses of Edinburgh celebrated Jonson's admittance as an honorary burgess, with an extravagant dinner costing a heady £221.06. Jonson's reception, however, was nothing in comparison to that accorded his royal patron, King James, the previous year, when the king had undertaken his own salmon-like journey, as he called it, to Scotland, the first time he had returned to the land of his birth since 1603. Many thousands were spent in welcoming the king and his retinue to Edinburgh, when dinners laid on by the burgesses necessitated the erection of a glass and wood pavilion on the High Street, and the fountains ran with wine. As the king and poet progressed north, both had crossed the Anglo-Scottish border, dividing the two kingdoms just north of Berwick-on-Tweed. James's journey had been facilitated by the connections built between the two former enemies following the union of the crowns, which all now rested upon his own head. James embodied that union, the King of England arriving in Edinburgh as King of Scotland too. Here we have him in 1603 riding down to London, described as great king of parts and arts, great Britain's king. Two famous kingdoms thou to one did spring. So there is a lot of expectation upon him. Jonson too, from the moment he crossed the border, had been forwarded along networks of Scottish gentlemen and nobles whose links to London had been established following that union of 1603. Both journeys, therefore, could be thought of as performing union, their movements embodying the links between the two kingdoms. Both journeys also took place against a febrile political background that had been stimulated in part by James's decision to reintroduce certain practices into the Scottish Church from 1617, attempts that were perceived by the more Presbyterian-minded in Scotland as suspiciously Anglican, suspiciously popish. James's big project, when he had arrived in Edinburgh in 1617, had been to secure the Scottish Parliament's agreement to these practices and its enactment of what notoriously became known as the 5 Articles of Perth. James had to back down, however, in 1617 in face of parliamentary resistance to the Articles, but in 1618 he was able to force them through the General Assembly of the Kirk that met at Perth that August. Jonson's arrival in Edinburgh came in the wake of that assembly, and the city will have been abuzz with debate over it. Another of James's big projects had been his attempt to secure a fuller union between England and Scotland than the mere union of the crowns. These efforts had largely failed in the English Parliament of 1607, stymied by the xenophobic and self-protective resistance of English members to anything other than the subjugation of Scotland to English law, a condition that no Scottish Parliament in the 17th century was going to accept. The Anglo-Scottish frontier remained a dividing line between two separate kingdoms. But James did succeed in maintaining the regal union. In this, he was aided by the networks of communication and interpersonal relationships that spanned the Anglo-Scottish border, linking the two kingdoms' capitals more closely than their physical distance might suggest. In 1618, James's clumsy attempts at Perth to enforce greater ecclesiastical conformity between the two kingdoms' churches could be viewed as part of his vision of a greater union. So today, I'm going to consider the significance of Jonson's foot voyage, as it was termed, within this wider picture of the union of the crowns and what it displayed of the more cohesive elements binding these two ancient enemies together. The social and political networks that arranged for Jonson's entertainment, forwarding him on from Berwick to Edinburgh and then on a whistle-stop tour of the chief attractions of Fife, represented conduits for communication in early modern Britain and a force for cohesion within the tensions of the regal union. James, the king, relied on networks such as these for the government of Scotland in his absence. But I'm also going to look at the less cohesive, simmering discontent engendered by the unpopular 5 Articles of Perth and how Jonson's journey might actually relate to this. The fortuitous timing of his arrival in the aftermath of the General Assembly and his connections within Scottish elites put him in an advantageous position to observe the political ramifications of Perth. Those articles that proved to be a focus for the discontent that ultimately exploded in the Covenanting Revolution of 1638. Jonson had declared as early as the summer of 1617 his intention to journey to the land he claimed of his forefathers in the spirit of a personal pilgrimage, but was his mission really rather more loaded than that? There was at the time some discussion over the reasons for Jonson's undertaking of such a physically arduous journey. In 1618, Jonson was at the height of his career. He had a yearly pension from the king, and he was in demand for his masques, plays, poems, and epitaphs. What Jonson did, therefore, was of note. A letter in 1617 observed, Ben Jonson is going on foot to Edinburgh and back for his profit. The precise meaning, though, behind that term profit is somewhat ambiguous, and I'd like to look more closely at what type of profit might have been planned or actually accrued, and what its political background might suggest of that. Details of Jonson's journey until recently were sparse. They amounted firstly to the lengthy notes made in January 1619 by his Scottish host, the poet Sir William Drummond, with whom Jonson stayed at Hawthornden for a fortnight. And secondly, in the Treasurer's accounts of the Edinburgh Council, showing the payment for that very costly dinner. And that was it, until the discovery by Professor James Locksley of the University of Edinburgh of a manuscript account of it, written by a companion on the walk. And here is the first page of it. It's a rather wonderful hand that I've spent a lot of time with, as has James in the last few years. Yes, so that it's entitled My Gossip Jonson, His Foot Voyage and Mine unto Scotland, and he refers to Jonson throughout as my gossip, implying some fairly intimate, friendly relationship, which we simply don't actually know the nature of at the moment. It may have been that it was a younger man, as has some sort of godfather relationship with a younger man. Though frustratingly the writer is never named, and despite all our digging this remains so, the account furnishes us with the details of nearly 300 people who Jonson met on his way, the grand houses and hostelries he stayed in, the route he took, and the sights he saw. And in some, it recalls the venison eaten and the copious downing of fine wine, as might be expected of such a thing bacchanalian. Jonson is revealed here as a more genial and generous character than the later descriptions give credit to, a likeable Jonson, amusedly tolerant of the drunken antics of others. So what does this account show of his objectives? Well, at no point does it actually spell out why he embarked on his voyage, or even why he made it all on foot. That said, something is suggested of his intentions. Most notably, the author observes that the civic officials and gentlemen toasting Jonson at the Market Cross did so, testifying in that place that he had performed his journey. And in its exhaustive record of Jonson's many encounters, the author appears to have been building a body of proof, listing people that could swear to Jonson's presence amongst them, and that he had walked every step of the way. The very existence of the manuscript itself is testament to the need to record such evidence. But what was behind this? Was there some kind of monetary profit expected from the successful completion of a wager? There is, however, no explicit reference to such a wager. Instead, several references are made to monetary donations to Jonson, such as the 30 pieces subscribed by the Earl of Rutland at Belvoir. In helping to finance the walk, they were possibly donating to the eventual publication of an account of it. This had been the objective behind the penniless pilgrimage undertaken by Jonson's fellow poet, John Taylor, up the west coast to Scotland that same summer. It was so called in Taylor's publication of his adventures because he'd vowed to do it without a penny in his pocket, profiting, he hoped, through the subscribers' purchase of his account. If this was Jonson's aim, then it was never fulfilled, following, as he was to claim, his manuscript's immolation in a fire in his study in 1623, the loss of which he lamented in a poem, An Execration upon Vulcan, that of my journey into Scotland sung with all the adventures, a very tantalising taster of what might have been. In 1618, Jonson was not apparently in financial difficulties. Indeed, most of what was subscribed on the walk he appears to have given away, at Leith to the impoverished John Taylor, to the new chapel at Buntingford, and treating the company at Witham, it was said that the bounty of his gossip made it dearer than the inn. His lengthy stay at Welbeck with Sir William Cavendish, the future Duke of Newcastle, produced a commission for an epitaph for the Cavendish tomb at Bolsover, and secured an important patron for Jonson. And the walk itself may not have cost that much, the price of a new pair of boots at Darlington, the stabling perhaps of a pack horse, and the few nights in which he stayed in an inn that someone else didn't cover. And in Scotland, he stayed exclusively within the houses of the lairds or nobility. So if not for immediate financial gain, perhaps that profit might have been less tangible. Undertaking such an adventure guaranteed Jonson a wealth of source material to draw upon. In his encounters with inebriated parsons, which we have quite a number of, burgesses and gents, an archbishop, one chancellor, and several earls. Tales of sights seen, the castles of Pontefract, as we've got up here, Warkworth, Dunstanburgh and Bamburgh in England, Tantallon, Dunglass, Aberdour and Edinburgh in Scotland, and the tales that the travellers were told about them. Here, as at Edinburgh Castle, of Mons Meg, the great cannon, it was said, the bore whereof was so big that one got a woman with child in it. And that's a new little snippet for Historic Scotland to include on their inebriation, their interpretation boards. One has the sense of Jonson the tourist scouring the landscape, stockpiling his experiences. Once he had reached Edinburgh, he grabbed a horse and took the ferry to Fife, where he viewed the remarkable coal mine at Curos that reputedly stretched for a mile underneath the Firth of Forth. From thence to the salt pans at Kincardine, the palace and abbey of Dunfermline, and then to Burnt Island via Aberdare Castle, looking out as he went at the abbey of Inchcombe and taking the fashionable therapeutic waters of the spring of Petticoeur. And that's a picture of Petticoeur from a contemporary publication in 1618. It doesn't look like that now. I'm not sure it ever looked like that then. There was too, perhaps, the satisfaction of a physical challenge completed, the more notable given Jonson's own portrayal of his widening girth. He'd written of Thomas Coriati's epic journeys around Europe in that Walker's Journal and was to compare Coriati's boots with his own. Others completed less arduous but equally remarkable journeys, like the actor William Kemp, whom Morris danced to Norwich, publishing his Odyssey in Kemp's 9 Days' Wonder. Another walked backwards to Berwick for a wager, whilst a Yorkshireman undertook to ride 5 times between London and York in 6 days, which he did to the general amazement of the court. The theatricality, and I think you get something of that there from the image, of Kemp's journey suggests something of a performance. And it seems too that Jonson was enacting his own work through a series of encounters with an ever-changing cast and staged on the Great North Road. As the account attests, he had performed his journey. But more tangible products were also intended. And here, Jonson's conversations with Drummond at Hawthornden, just outside Edinburgh, and their subsequent correspondence are invaluable. He told Drummond that several works were planned. First, he is to writ his foot pilgrimage hither and to call it a discovery in a poem he calls Edinburgh, the heart of Scotland, Britain's other eye. This perhaps is the manuscript destroyed in the fire, if indeed it was ever written. But he also appears to have been mulling over more creative projects. He hath intention to write a fisher or pastoral play and set the stage of it in the Loch Lomond Lake. And finally, Drummond writes that Jonson had an intention to perfect an epic poem entitled Hierologia of the Worthies of his country, roused by fame, and was to dedicate it to his country. It has been previously assumed that Jonson meant here of England, but James Loxley has now persuasively argued that his country, in the context of a conversation taking place near Edinburgh and by someone claiming Scottish ancestry, was more probably Scotland. Once back down in England, Jonson was to write to Drummond for further information on Edinburgh's borough laws, the inscriptions at Pinkie, the Earl of Dunfermline's house, the modes of study at St Andrews in Edinburgh, and that piece of the Pucelle of Court which was stolen out of his pocket by a gentleman who drank him drowsy. So I think we have an indication of what was going on when Jonson was here. Background, perhaps, for those intended works. Jonson enclosed too a couple of poems for Drummond, including the self-deprecating My Portrait Left in Scotland, in which he portrayed himself as a grey-haired, middle-aged man of 20 stone, with a mountain belly and a rocky face, articulating an image that has framed subsequent portrayals, rather unfortunately, I think. One might question whether such an overweight man would have managed the 15 miles a day that Jonson achieved, or was this Jonson at his most wry? This was potentially a large body of work to come out of his Scottish journey, and presumably Jonson had specific audiences in mind. Perhaps the account of his journey was intended for those subscribers on the foot voyage. Was the pastoral set in Loch Lomond one destined for the Blackfriars stage, or perhaps the royal apartments at Whitehall? And who did he think his Hierologia of Scotland would appeal to? There is an indication, perhaps, in his letter to Drummond in May 1619 on his return to London. Here he seems to have made haste to court, in the hope, it seems, for his royal patron's approval. Jonson was therefore glad to relay that he'd received a most Catholic welcome from King James, and that my reports were not unacceptable to his majesty. He professed, I thank God, some joy to see me, and is pleased to hear of the purpose of my book. Whether the book referred to was the foot pilgrimage or the worthies of Scotland is unclear, but his relief at James's favourable reception of him and his planned publications is manifest. So too is his relief over James's reaction to his reports. And it's here I'd like to suggest that the profit for which Jonson was most hoping lay, crucially, in the hands of the king. That's a rather elongated picture actually come out of James in his full majesty down in London. But let us join Jonson now as he leaves the hospitable hands of the aldermen of Berwick-on-Tweed and crosses the Anglo-Scottish border. 2 miles out of town, wine was drunk again, and a company of musketeers gave us a volley of shot as they left England for Scotland. Jonson's companion, however, makes no note of the border. This differs from the emphasis in John Taylor's description of his border crossing on the western route. 8 miles from Carlisle runs a little river, which England's bounds from Scotland's grounds does sever. Without horse, bridge, or boat I o'er did get, on foot I went, yet scarce my shoes did wet. Recounting past hostilities, Taylor seems to have expected that the division represented by the River Sark might have been etched into the land. Instead, he seems surprised that I'm being come to this long looked for land, did mark, remark, note, renote, viewed, and scanned. No one claims he's a good poet. And I saw nothing that could change my will, but that I thought myself in England still. The kingdoms are so nearly joined and fixed, there scarcely went a pair of shears betwixt. There are echoes here of Drummond of Hawthornden's own description of the river Tweed, which no more our kingdoms shall divide, in his poem Fourth Feasting, that he gave in welcome to James the King the previous year. Now all of this would have pleased James, for whom the territorial congruity of Scotland and England underpinned union. These two countries, he said, being separated neither by sea nor great river, mountain, nor other strength of nature, so they are divided only in apprehension rather than in effect. Now, those that were borderers themselves cannot distinguish nor discern their own limits. Jonson's crossing of those limits embodied the connections that now transcended the old dividing line. At Ayton Castle, they were received by George Hume, the first of many of Scottish gentlemen who were to entertain them, and then forward them onwards. There, Valentine West played his prank and drink, keeping them up late. This must have engendered a hangover, for the following day's walk over the moors to Cobham's Path is described by Jonson's companion as the most tedious day's journey in the whole voyage, for I had not slept 2 nights before. At Cobham's Path, they weathered the liberal entertainment for which William Arnott was famed. From there, they carried on to Dunbar to stay with James Bailey at Loch End, the man who had been responsible for the logistical arrangements of James's visit in 1617, when he had spent over £50,000 and had had to go to France for fine wines. From there, Jonson walked on to Oldham by Tantallon to stay with the Auchmuty brothers. The playwright was familiar with these gentlemen, having encountered them already at court. John, the eldest, was one of James's grooms of the bedchamber, and had appeared earlier that year in Jonson's Masque for the honour of Wales. A year later, Jonson was to write to Auchmuty, thanking him for the hospitable favours I received of him in Scotland and elsewhere, promising this small present, which we don't quite know what that was, of affection is sent and dedicated till better comes by. From Oldham, the Auchmutys accompanied Jonson to North Berwick and the house of Sir John Hume. Here, Jonson was entertained by a group of sheep shearers who made great suit to have a sight of him. And the account goes, so he walked up into the fields where there were a number of them with a bagpipe, who no sooner saw my gossip, but they circled around him and danced round about him. Here too, William Ramsay, another of the king's household, had ridden from Edinburgh with 2 other gents to meet Jonson and to arrange his onward journey. In this they were foiled by the Earl of Winton, who waylaid us and stayed us at Seaton, where we met with my Lord Bothwell. The day after that, the 2 earls brought my gossip on the way, and other gentlemen brought him through to Preston Pans and then to Musselburgh. Here perhaps the hospitality began to catch up with Jonson, since he grew exceedingly sick. They pressed on, however, into Edinburgh, and at the Netherbow port they were reunited with William Ramsay, with 3 other Scottish gentlemen of the royal households, who were all waiting to welcome the travellers to their final destination. And this is a map from Blaeu's Atlas of 1654 of Fife mainly, but it does helpfully give us the other side of the Firth. And you can see Jonson's journey here, and then his little whistle-stop tour around Fife on the left. 2 days later, Jonson and his companion, now saddled up, rode out of Edinburgh accompanied by some of these courtiers. Taking the ferry across the Firth, the first night on their dash around Fife was spent at Sir George Bruce's fine new house at Curos. If one wants to get a sense of the world in which Jonson was moving, it's worth a visit to this National Trust property, to stand in the chambers decorated still with the original wall paintings. One might imagine James VI and First himself standing in the same rooms, looking out over the Firth, since he had too stayed with Bruce the previous year, for the same purpose as Jonson, to view Bruce's extraordinary coal mine. It appears to have been a popular attraction, a sort of regular item on the heritage trail of Fife. The famed ingenuity of the coal mine and its waterworks, of which Taylor, the water poet, was to write at hyperbolic length. Having then viewed the salt pans and his rare waterwork there, Jonson and his party rode into Dunfermline. And this is one, I love this picture, because this is really how Jonson might have approached Dunfermline, because it's from the west, the sort of southwest, and it might well have been very much the view that he had as he came up there from Curos. It's Slazer, 1693, and you can look at all of the maps that I'm using on the NLS Maps website. Fantastic resource. So they rode into Dunfermline, where they were greeted by Alexander Seton, the Earl of Dunfermline, and his wife, shooting at butts. Practising archery, that is, in the walled garden of Queen Anna's palace of Dunfermline, nestled by the ancient abbey. Alexander was a favourite of the Queen and Baillie of her regality of Dunfermline. That's why he got the palace. As significant as that connection was, however, Dunfermline's office of Chancellor of Scotland put him at the apex of the Scottish elites. So we see here in Dunfermline, Jonson being received by one of the most powerful men in Scotland very soon after he had arrived in the country, and a man with a direct line to the king. Dunfermline's weekly correspondence with James and his senior courtiers maintained that close connection. He sent long reports south of significant events and received news and commands from Whitehall in return. The Earl will have almost certainly, though I haven't found it, it's very frustrating, there's so many letters to and from Dunfermline, but I haven't found one that would have, I'm sure there would have been one providing advance warning of Jonson's journey. And the playwright and Chancellor will have had things in common, most particularly their classical humanist education that shaped their works. Yeah, this interest is visually depicted on the neo-Steric painted ceiling of the long upper room at Dunfermline's House Pinkie, now part of Loretto's School, in a multitude of allegorical scenes embellished with classical mottos. Dunfermline himself probably appears as the poet Pindar, and thank you to Michael Bath for this. Subsequently, Jonson was to ask Drummond of Hawthornden to send details of these, and it's not too fanciful, perhaps, to imagine Dunfermline and Jonson conversing beneath them. At Dunfermline, both Jonson and his companion drank hard and were made honorary burgesses by the town. That done, the Earl passed him on to John Gibb, one of the King's oldest retainers, who held a house in the Abbey precincts. Gibb's son Henry was another of James's bedchamber. The Gibbs, we are told, used my gossip and his company with all freedom and full entertainment, suggesting that Jonson was still surrounded by that gaggle of courtiers. 2 days later, they rode eastwards from Dunfermline to take the waters of Petticoat, the spring still detectable in the hill above the old quayside. This was a fashionable pursuit that summer. 2 books just published proclaiming its virtues. The Earl of Morton met other gentlemen there that August, as did John Taylor, with a number of gents who were then later to meet Jonson. Hopefully the therapeutic waters will have proved restorative after the travellers' overindulgence at Dunfermline. And actually in the book, it does say it's meant to be good for anyone suffering from a surfeit. That done, the party crossed back over the Firth to Leith, and here again we see Jonson being taken care of, lodged with John Stewart, the younger brother of the Lord Bothwell, whom the playwright had dined with at Seaton. The following day they went hawking. There they found yet more courtiers assembled, some of them about to depart south for London, for the King had now returned from his summer progresses and was in need of their services. We still don't know how Jonson passed the intervening months, but after Christmas we find him ensconced at Hawthornden with one of Scotland's leading poets, William Drummond. Drummond was the nephew of Queen Anna's secretary, William Fowler, and had visited him at court in London a few years earlier. Perhaps he had met Jonson then, in the aftermath of Jonson's Masque of Blackness, written for the Queen. Certainly he had a copy of Jonson's epigrams by 1612. Shortly before Jonson's arrival, Drummond was exchanging letters with the poet Michael Drayton in London, a man from Jonson's own literary milieu that included too John Donne. And within that same circle was the Scottish poet Sir Robert Ayton. So I think what we can see here is Jonson with significant connections within Scotland's literary fraternity too, both the court and the literary fraternity, and obvious crossovers there. So here's that route again. From the moment Jonson crossed the border, we can see him moving along courtly and aristocratic networks that arranged private accommodation, not inns, and lavish entertainment. This ready absorption of the famed playwright into such elite circles indicated he was already known to them, or known of, at least. Those that were courtiers he'd probably already met. He'd perhaps discussed his itinerary in advance with them. We see Jonson dining with some of Scotland's governing elite, the Chancellor at Dunfermline, and the Chancellor's nephew, the Earl of Winton, at Seaton, himself a senior Privy Councillor. In these men's assiduous management of Jonson's experience in Scotland and their close connections to James's court, we can possibly see the King himself directing these men to assist Jonson. For whilst Jonson was hugely, of course, dependent on royal patronage for his continued income, the King was also concerned to increase the acceptability of union. Jonson's planned Scottish works promised to paint a good picture of England's northern neighbours, and Jonson's Voyage itself embodied the workings of that union, as he was forwarded along networks and through social spaces that spanned the Anglo-Scottish border. The channels of communication provided by these networks allowed information to flow relatively easily between the King in London and the governing elites of Scotland. James had done quite a bit to make sure that the postal network, which certainly extended to Berwick before he became King of England, then to extend further onwards to Edinburgh. This network of the postal system, and also of men on horses, courtiers and others riding to and fro from London, forwarded crucial information about governmental, political and religious affairs in Scotland down to James at Whitehall. And it's here that we can possibly see another of the things that the king was expecting from Jonson. Those reports that James was to receive so favourably on Jonson's return. This is another of the wonderful sleighs of pictures, this time of I've highlighted St John's Kirk in Perth. Jonson arrived in Edinburgh 3 weeks after the dramatic meeting of the General Assembly of the Kirk in St John's Kirk at Perth on the 25th of August, as Jonson caroused his way through Northumberland. This assembly had been called specifically to discuss the 5 articles, which contentiously called for kneeling during communion, anathema to Presbyterians, and the observance of the holy days of Christmas and Easter, amongst other things. These were the articles which James had failed to get through the Scottish Parliament in 1617. At Perth, however, his chief henchman, the Archbishop, rather scary Archbishop Spottiswoode, was to manage proceedings rather more tightly. As James wrote to the Assembly, "We have place to dispose of things in the church," which many of the audience would have disagreed with, "to induce them to an obedient yielding unto these things, and do not think that we will be satisfied with excuses or delays or mitigations, for we will content ourselves with nothing but a simple and direct acceptation of these articles." And he sent as his eyes and ears the English Dean of Winchester to check up on the Assembly, to see who was voting what. 2 days later, as the vote was taken, the Assembly was reminded, "Have the king in your mind. Remember of the king. Look to the king." James, unsurprisingly, got his way. But although most of the nobility and commissioners present did accept the articles, 45 ministers voted against them. These may have included Robert Colville, with whom Jonson was to dine and whose sermon he was to hear 4 weeks later at Curos. Colville had been one of the 55 signatories the previous year of a protestation on the liberties of the Kirk that had absolutely enraged the king. So one can only really imagine Jonson and Colville's conversation. I would have loved to have been there. The Presbyterian historian David Calderwood was to record at length the subsequent non-compliance of ministers and parishioners to these articles. Amongst these, the good burgesses of Edinburgh were notable. As Jonson was absorbed into their circles that winter, the king wrote to the Presbyterian ministers of Edinburgh, ordering them to celebrate Christmas Day. Lord Binning subsequently assured James that the provost, bailies and council had dutifully convoyed my Lord Chancellor Dunfermline to the High Church to St Giles, and were all present at sermon, so as there was no default for want of their good example, indicating that they had taken communion on their knees as the articles required. In contrast, however, Calderwood recounts that St Giles was not half filled. So who do you want to believe? And the dogs were playing in the midst of the floor of the little kirk for rarity of people. So there is certainly some suggestion that the very people that Jonson is moving in are very reluctant to turn up at church where they know that the service is going to be undertaken in the new manner. In February, 3 merchant burgesses, unfortunately not named, were called before the Court of High Commission for dissuading others from attending the Christmas service. Given that several of Jonson's hosts attended that contentious service, was Jonson there himself that day? I like to think he was. Resistance to the 5 articles began to build, and at Easter 1619, many parishioners left Edinburgh, where communion according to the 5 articles was to be enforced, to attend other kirks where it was not. The Chancellor Dunfermline and the Privy Council took communion on their knees that day in St Giles, but Sir William Nisbet the provost, who had welcomed Jonson so heartily to Edinburgh 6 months previously and had been in St Giles at Christmas, now absented himself, resolved not to take communion kneeling. And it was also noted that the university's Kirk, the congregation, for the most part, kneeled not. Universities, as ever, a centre for resistance. King James was aware of this burgeoning resistance, particularly significant coming as it did from civic officials and ministers of his Scottish capital. On the 11th of June, a month after Jonson had returned to London, the Provost and Bailies received a letter from the King, rebuking them sharply for suffering the inhabitants of the town to hear seditious speeches. The following day, the King's Guard raided the house and booth of the bookseller Andrew Hart and 2 others, searching for books and pamphlets set out against Perth Assembly, it said. This was not enough, however, to scare Edinburgh's ministers and burgesses into submission. And in December 1619, the King ordered the replacement of borough officials in Edinburgh and Canongate. The councils, he said, were instead to choose none other but such as would conform themselves to the acts of the late Assembly at Perth. As a result, Sir William Nisbet and others lost office. I think we can't underestimate the damage, the alienation caused among Presbyterian circles by these 5 articles. 20 years later, they were still a focus for discontent. And here is a publication of roughly 20 years later, dispute against the English popish ceremonies intruded upon the Church of Scotland, amongst which the 5 articles of Perth are very prominent. Jonson's arrival in September 1618 put him in the centre of these debates amongst both the King's most loyal supporters and dependents and those that were to resist the 5 articles. Although I'm not suggesting that his journey's prime objective was at the behest of the King will have been keen to hear his poet's impressions of the political situation in Scotland. Simultaneously, Jonson's civic hosts will have been aware of his standing with the King, and careful, therefore, to encourage a good report of their loyal and hospitable performance. Jonson's companion notes specifically that the good burgesses of Edinburgh, celebrating Jonson's arrival at the Market Cross, had also toasted the King's health. At that moment, King James's main preoccupation in Scotland was to achieve greater ecclesiastical congruity between England and Scotland, an objective which formed a central part in his wider vision of fuller union. Those burgesses toasting his health were to prove very resistant to the 5 articles. Their resistance was but the forerunner of the explosion against Charles I's more forceful attempts at ecclesiastical conformity that were to directly lead to the Covenanting Revolution and the potential sundering of union. Jonson was a playwright alert to the political and religious sensitivities of the time, and in particular his royal employer's agenda, no more so than over Anglo-Scottish union. Some of the worst xenophobia amongst the English politicians, describing the swarms of ravenous Scots pilfering the plums of James's favour, came from the legal fraternity, who frequented the same convivial societies in London as Jonson. Indeed, in 1605, Jonson had fallen foul of the King over his jibes at Scotsmen in his play Eastward Ho, and his careful celebration of union in the court masque Hymenai in 1606 sought to repair that damage. His subsequent deployment of Scottish courtiers in his masque helped to cement ties between Jonson and his ancestral homeland that proved of great use on his northern travels. Jonson's own tendencies towards Catholicism, however, don't make him natural allies, I think, with his Presbyterian civic hosts in Edinburgh. But he does appear to have happily inhabited their space, sending his very warm wishes to the Nisbets and others in 1619. This is Berwick-on-Tweed. I thought the final image should be a picture of the bridge that links the 2 countries. even though technically, of course, it's into England still. What can we make of all this? Jonson's foot voyage to Scotland embodied some of the ambiguities in the union forged between two ancient enemies in 1603. Using as he did the new social, political and cultural networks that spanned the old international border, his movements along the Great North Road, newly extended to Edinburgh, represented these more cohesive connections. At the same time, however, his travelling was to put him in contact with Scotsmen less knitted into those networks, and who were increasingly feeling the distance from their absent king. The simmering discontent manifested over the 5 Articles of Perth may have been part of a wider unease, reflecting lost contact with James. As Drummond of Hawthornden was to write in his poem of welcome to James, "Forth feasting, ah, why should Isis only see thee shine? Is not thy forth as well as Isis thine? Now when by honour drawn thou shalt away, to her already jealous of thy stay, when in her amorous arms she doth thee fold, and dries thy dewy hairs with hers of gold, much questioning of thy fare, much of thy sport, much of thine absence, long, howe'er so short, and chides perhaps thy coming to the north, loath not to think on thy much loving forth." The sense of loss apparent in Drummond's Forth feasting at once reaffirmed Scottish loyalty to their king, as it bemoaned his absence. Jonson's steps amongst Edinburgh's civic elites gave them an opportunity to voice this unease, as much as it allowed him to observe them in this city, Britain's other eye. Thank you.